Okay, so this is episode 4 of Dead Bodies and Domestic Advice. It is my final episode in this series, and we're going to be talking specifically about women who were in the funeral industry in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So I have 3 guests with me for this episode. Grayson.
Hi, I'm Grayson. I'm a student at Wheaton College, and I am a part of History Club.
Elio.
Hello, I'm Elio, and I'm also part of History Club at Wheaton College.
And Hal.
Hi, I'm Hal. I'm a student at Wheaton College, and I am part of History Club.
Great. So where I dropped off last episode was talking about how I looked at State Board of Health reports and State Department of Health reports for all the states in New England and in the state of Maine from 1903 to 1919. And I was able to access records showing people who have passed the embalming examination and also got their licenses to embalm dead bodies. And in that, I was able to find that 15 women passed in that period. 2 women passed twice, and many of these women were married to funeral directors, embalmers, undertakers, which I know not only from the census, and I'll get into my census data shortly, but also from the fact that their husbands were on the same lists, passing the exams in the same year. So these are ventures that wives and husbands went into together. However, despite the evidence that I'm about to present, the official history, which is a term I know that is used quite a lot to distinguish between what actual history is, but had this as a masculine industry. So trade journals such as The Casket and The Sunny Side, which were 2 larger ones that primarily came out of the Midwest, but still had impact across the country, put their origins in the Civil War and in men who had developed embalming as a scientific practice and as a medical procedure, less women who had been taking care of bodies for centuries, and not really recognizing them and their practice as the precursor to the funeral industry. And also, women who did write into these journals, of who there are few, were often regarded as peculiarities and openly discussed as such in these journals, even despite their advocacy for women in the profession. So I want to talk a little bit about what wives were expected to do in the late 19th century, how this translates into taking care of dead bodies, and then finally the women that I have found who did this work. So in the late 19th century, domestic manuals were much more popular. They had started to become popular in the early to mid 19th century and then picked up. Obviously, there's Catherine Beecher's Treatise on Domestic Economy. That was one of the largest ones. And these domestic advice manuals, as well as cookbooks, which aren't like the same as cookbooks we think about now, contained multitudes of advice about not only, what are some fun recipes you can cook for your family, but how to take care of your house, how to throw dinner parties, and how to take care of the ill. And so those sections on how to take care of the sick could include practical procedures, for lack of a better term, such as like setting a bone or like administering a splint before you can get to like actual medical care, because this was less of wives being the primary care. They certainly were still engaging in primary care of their families, but it was more expected now that you would outsource to a nurse or a doctor, because houses would still fall apart if a wife wasn't there to take care of everything, if she was by the sick bed. So having a nurse there at least alleviated her some that she could still maintain domain over her house, because this is someone who works for her, without having to completely drop everything. So women were still being intimately tied to bodies. And also there was this new trend in domestic advice manuals and cookbooks, which had to do with cleanliness. People were extremely concerned about cleanness, which is really fair considering how fast urbanization happened and how ill-equipped municipal officials and citizens were able to deal with it. There weren't efficient sewage systems. There wasn't a strong knowledge of how things actually made you sick. So the most common example is there were multiple cholera outbreaks that happened from people throwing human waste into water sources, and they just didn't realize that this is something that was going to make them sick. So these domestic advice manuals would talk about how to keep a clean home and especially how to ventilate your home and sanitize it. If this was not a section in a cookbook or domestic advice manual, it would be a full chapter. It would be a full book. This is how concerned people were for it. Bad air is something we don't really think about now. We think about air cleanliness in terms of pollution, but not in terms of like being around someone. It's certainly still contagion, but not in the same context where any sort of bad air will make you sick. Things can be stinky and not make you sick, but that wasn't really the concept that people had in the late 19th century. And so keeping a well-ventilated house, keeping your house smelling nice was very, very important for your health. The other thing that these books encouraged was actually for wives to find employment. Not all of them did, certainly, but many recognized that wives might have husbands who weren't the best providers in the world, who either could not or would not provide for their families, or that they might need additional help. And what better help than your wife, who you don't necessarily need to pay, and who would be already in a subservient position to you. So authors like William Alcott, who is related to Louisa May Alcott, advocated for women's education so long as it helps the husband. He went further than other people in advocating that like the husband should set up this like curriculum for his wife and like really oversee her education. And while many domestic advice manuals certainly said like, you know, your husband should determine what you learned, it wasn't really to the same degree. Jobs that were suitable for women that may have gone outside the bounds of what her husband did included nurse and dentist. The dentist one's really interesting. It's outside the scope of this research, but I still think it's interesting. But these are jobs that work with the body because people are still thinking that women are naturally inclined healers, which it's certainly true that women can be very good healers, but it's not sort of any innate ability. It's just compassion and to what degree you have it. So with this in mind, I want to start talking about the women that I actually did found, the wives that I found, because my thesis, as I'll state again, is that wives use the roles and responsibilities of their station to give them access to dead bodies. And wives were being encouraged to do things that economically benefited their husband and to keep cleanliness, sickness, and sanitation in mind. So they're intimately aware of bodies. They might be there when someone actually passes because they're by the sick bed. They need to keep places clean and well ventilated, which is especially important when you're working with like embalming fluids and other chemicals. And you're supposed to do things that your husband does. So if your husband's a funeral director, it works out. So this is where I'm going to get into the census and business directory information I have and talk about women who were specifically involved in this in the marketplace. So this research I did, I used ancestry.com. It is currently free for Maine residents through the library system in Maine. So that was really great for me. And I looked through business directories and censuses. And I want to acknowledge that I do not think these lists are complete because it also depends on what records ancestry.com has. There's also the instance that the 1890 census is gone. It burned in a fire. I don't know why it was the only one being kept in this place that caught on fire, but most of it's gone. So I don't really have anything from 1890. But I'm going to start with business directories because they sort of precede when occupations were being listed in the census. And the two business directories that I want to talk about the most, because certainly there were women in everyone, but in the main business directory, I found 7 different women who were listing themselves out, like publicly saying, I do this, you can hire me for services. And they did it for a really long time. Isabella Westcott, she lived in Portland, Maine. She was in the records from 1895 to 1903 and listed as an undertaker. And then in New Hampshire, there were 7 different women as well. And Evangelist Turcotte did this from 1885 to 1907, and was listed as being an undertaker and also having coffin ware rooms. And there were also other things like she sold coal, so sort of a side gig, or maybe like the undertaker was a side gig, who knows. There were women who listed themselves out in different states, but the reason I'm not focusing on business directories explicitly is that because many of these women sort of came and went. Why they chose to put themselves in the business directory certain years and not in other years, I don't fully have an answer. Maybe most likely just depended on how much they needed the clientele boost. The other thing about business directories is for businesses themselves, like funeral homes, they would run advertisements in business directories as well as like newspapers and such that would read normally to the effect of lady assistants in attendance. So saying, we do have women here, because as some women advocated, Minnie Atwood, who was a funeral director and embalmer in New Hampshire with her husband, William, advocated for women taking care of dead bodies. This was nothing that she would have to advocate at the start of the century, but this was in 1895. And she advocated for it because she only saw it as proper that a woman is taking care of a woman's body and children's bodies. And so it was good marketing and profitable for a funeral home to say, we do have women here, so it will not just be a man taking care of whatever woman's body. And then I also have the census. So I looked through the census I'm talking about the long 19th century. So I looked all throughout the 19th century in terms of 1800, 1920, 1900, and then extended to 1920. So going into the entirety of World War I, yes. But I think that it's important because these numbers are still relevant to what I'm talking about. They're still influenced by what was happening at the turn of the century. So in Maine, I found 32 different women from 1900 to 1920. 62% were married or widowed. I don't explicitly address widows. I didn't address them in my capstone, and I haven't really addressed them in my research in terms of like what connotation being a widow specifically will give a person. But as these people who were married and would have the same backgrounds as wives who did currently have a husband, I am including them. And then in the, what is that, 62%? So the 38% who aren't listed, those are individuals who are either single or divorced. I included divorced in there because they've lost that status through their own free will. There obviously were circumstances in which a wife needed to leave, and that's entirely valid, but divorced women still have a connotation, like sometimes a negative connotation in society today. So I want to address that. 4 of the women in Maine were also married to undertakers. In New Hampshire, there were 12 different women, same period, 1900 to 1920. All of these are 1900, 1920. 83% of them were widowed or married. One was married to an undertaker, and that was Minnie Edwards Atwood, who I just discussed a little bit. In Vermont, there were 4 women, 75% were married or widowed, but none of them had undertaker husbands. In Massachusetts, there were 48 women, 77% were married or widowed, and 16 had husbands who were also undertakers or funeral directors. And then Rhode Island, 10 women, 80% married, 1 undertaker husband. Connecticut, 25 women, 68% were widowed or married, and 5 were married to undertakers. And in the case of one of them, Sarah Boynton, her husband Floyd Boynton, as well as their son Wilson, were all undertakers. So that was like a true family business where you're getting the kids involved. And I think that opens an immediate question to, okay, so like these women weren't all married. Like even if they were married, they weren't necessarily married to undertakers. So like, does this just prove your thesis? And I don't think it does, because I am not giving a reason as to why all women are able to take care of dead bodies. I'm speaking very specifically about wives. And I think that there can be more than one reason. So this is research that I want to continue. And I think that my line of thinking, my research, and my justification is valid. But if I ever publish this one day, I know that I will be subject to academia and its critics. So I understand that people might have issues with my thesis. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I'm saying it works. And so I want to close this out with one last story about one woman in particular who I followed well past 1920 because I was interested in her story, and I had the fortune to actually find her gravestone. And that is Bernice White, who lived in Bangor, Maine. She was married to Ralph White. They both passed the embalming examination from the state in 1909, and then began appearing in business directories in 1910. Initially, Bernice and Ralph were listed together. And they were listed as undertakers, and then eventually undertakers and embalmers, and then undertakers, embalmers, and funeral directors. And they were listed as such until 1926, when Ralph White partnered with Malcolm Hayes, another funeral director in Bangor, to create the White and Hayes Funeral Home. At this point, Bernice is still being listed in these business directories, but she is listed on her own. Malcolm White and Hayes Funeral Home advertises a lady assistant in attendance, but never explicitly names Bernice. She was involved until her death, even after her husband passed. And when she was eventually buried in Mount Hope, the records that they have list her occupation as funeral director. And so if you were to ask, well, you know, wives were expected to be at home, and they were expected to be like gentle and maybe even a little like squeamish and not into dead bodies. Like, don't you think these wives are transgressors? I say no, because she was still subservient in her position. She wasn't pressing too hard upon her husband's business. And it was clear that she had a second seat to the masculine people in her life. So no, I don't think that any of these women are transgressors. I think they fit into the role of wives as they were expected to. How they felt about that, I will never know. But yes, women took care of their bodies, and it's an important part of history that should be acknowledged. So that is my research. Are there any questions or comments or any thoughts you have about all of that? Yes.
I love that this is what you chose for research, because I have a women and gender studies minor, so I also do a little women's studies, and I love how women wear so many different hats.
Mhm.
And like men are just like, they have their one job, and then the women just do it all, from the home to the dead. And I think your point too, how they were also dentists, is really interesting. Like, they have to do with all the bodies. So this idea of cleanliness and how women chose like and fell into this role is just really fascinating to me, because they seem like such masculine industries nowadays. But women were really the people who started it.
Yeah. Yes, most certainly. I know in doing this research, I was advised to look at like more recent articles about women in the funeral industry to see if they had any sort of history, and some did. And a lot of them were like, oh, women were coming back. They're coming back to the industry. But like, that's not really true. They never left. And in even some of the articles I've read that were defending women's pre-market care of the dead, they would get to the end and be like, yeah, they probably kept doing it as like a family business. And it's like most certainly true. I mean, in the case of Sarah Boynton, her whole family was doing it, and a lot of them were married, but there are also women who were doing this like as singles and getting involved in this business. So this is something that women have always been doing. Anything else that anyone wants to say? No pressure there. Well, thank you so much for listening. This has been a lot of work, but it's been extremely fun. And I'm very excited to continue this on even after I leave Wheaton. So yeah, thank you.